Autumn of 1874. The sun was sinking low over the high plains of New Mexico Territory, bleeding red fire across a sky smeared with dust. Wind scoured the empty prairie, carrying the hiss of sand against dry fence posts and the faint groan of a ranch house weathered to gray. The land looked endless, barren, and cruel, an ocean of grass, broken only by distant buttes, rising like silent sentinels. Elias Boone stood alone at the edge of that horizon, hat brim pulled low, the weight of years carved deep in his face. He was a man worn by solitude, his calloused hands rougher than the land he worked. His herd had dwindled, his pockets emptied, and still he lingered here, too stubborn to leave. Every night the wind howled through his broken shutters, reminding him he was the last Boone alive on this stretch of dirt. That evening, silence shattered. From the direction of town came the echo of hooves fast, desperate. A wagon rolled into view, its iron wheels kicking sparks against stone. The driver, drunk and swaying, yanked the reins until the team reared, stopping right before Boone's gate. He leapt down, staggering toward the rancher with a grin too wide for the hour. In the wagon bed lay a shape beneath a torn canvas. Boone's hand hovered near his holster, breath tight in his chest. The driver tore back the covering with a flourish, and there she was, bound at the wrists, taller than any woman Boone had ever seen, her black hair tangled in the wind, eyes burning with fury even as her mouth was gagged. The drunk spat into the dirt. "Cost me more whiskey than I got left in my soul. But she's yours now, Boone, if you've still got coin to spare. Giant bride for a dying ranch. Seems a fair trade." The prairie wind fell still, as though the land itself held its breath. Boone's world, quiet, predictable, and starved of hope, was about to change forever. But before we continue, make sure to like and subscribe for more untold Wild West stories. The deal was struck before Boone even knew his mouth had formed the words. His hand, trembling more from emptiness than from drink, pulled the last crumpled bills from his coat pocket and pressed them into the drunk's palm. It wasn't a fortune, barely enough to buy a saddle mule, but it was all he had left. The man laughed, shoved Boone against the wagon rail for good measure, and left him standing there in the fading light, while the horses clattered off into the dusk. Boone turned back to the wagon bed. The woman, his so-called bride, sat upright now, towering even as she remained bound. Her eyes burned like embers beneath a curtain of tangled black hair, and when he cut the rope at her wrists, she did not flinch. She stood, her frame casting a shadow across his yard, broad-shouldered and tall, nearly a head over Boone himself. For a moment, he thought she might crush him then and there. Instead, she ripped the gag from her mouth, spat into the dirt, and spoke only one word. "Why?" The question pierced him harder than any bullet. He had no answer fit for it. All Boone could muster was a rough whisper. "Because I couldn't let him keep you." The prairie wind moaned through the cottonwoods as the night pressed in. He led her inside, where the fire was low and the rafters groaned with age. She moved cautiously, ducking beneath the doorframe, her gaze scanning every shadow like a caged hawk set suddenly free. Boone fetched water, pushed it across the table, and tried not to stare. The next morning, the weight of what he'd done settled on him like the chill that seeps into bones before dawn. Out here, no church bells tolled for marriage, no preacher signed papers, but everyone knew the code. A man who brought a woman under his roof claimed responsibility, for better or worse. Boone felt it in the way the land itself seemed to look at him differently, the corral posts leaning, the dust shifting, the silence growing heavier. She rose with the sun, standing at the window where the prairie rolled out like an endless sea. Boone caught her reflection in the glass, her jaw set, her shoulders squared, as if daring the world to try and break her again. He wanted to ask her name, but the words stuck in his throat. She gave it to him anyway, sharp as a knife. "Nahele." It was the first thing she had offered freely. That day he set her to work, not out of cruelty, but because he had no choice. The herd was thin, the fences split, the well pump coughing like an old man. Alone, Boone would have buckled beneath it all. With Nahele beside him, the work carried on, though strangers they remained. Her hands, broad and strong, fixed what he could not. Her back did not bend beneath the weight of logs he could barely drag. She moved with a grace that belied her size, a steady rhythm like the beat of a drum on some faraway plain. Yet the land whispered of trouble. Boone knew the men in town, knew their sneers and whispers, their hunger for spectacle. A rancher near broke, dragging home a giant woman as his bride. Such a tale would travel faster than wildfire on prairie grass. That evening, as the first stars crept across the sky, Boone sat by the fire, staring into the orange glow. Nahili sat opposite him, silent, her profile hard against the flicker of light. She hadn't thanked him. She hadn't cursed him either. She simply was immovable, undeniable, a force planted in his life by fate or folly. Boone's heart thudded with a truth he could not escape. There was no turning back. Whatever bound them now, it was more than coin or chance. She was his responsibility, his burden, his partner in survival whether she wished it or not. And out here, under the wide and merciless sky, once a path was taken, it stretched on like the horizon itself, endless and unforgiving. The night closed around them, thick with silence. Boone lay awake long after the fire died, staring at the beams overhead, listening to the steady breath of the woman who would change the course of his life. In the West, men chose their roads, or sometimes the roads chose them. Boone had stepped onto his, and already the sound of boots and whispers was rising on the wind, coming from town. The gossip spread faster than the wind could carry dust across the plain. By the third morning, when Boone hitched his wagon for supplies, he felt the weight of eyes before he even reached town. The single dirt street of Carrizo lay simmering under the noon sun, its clapboard buildings sagging like old men, and every doorway seemed filled with stares. The blacksmith leaned on his hammer, spitting tobacco juice in the dust. "There goes Boone," he muttered loud enough for half the town to hear. Couldn't keep a herd, so he bought himself a circus act. Laughter followed, mean and sharp. Boone kept his head low, hat brim shadowing his eyes, but Nahil was beside him, walking tall. She towered above the townsfolk, her stride long and unhurried. Her gaze met theirs, unblinking, and the laughter faltered. Still, whispers swirled like snakes in the grass. Inside the general store, the air was thick with the smell of flour and leather. The shopkeeper, Mr. Grady, adjusted his spectacles and stared openly. "Boone," he drawled, "I reckon you'll be wantin' double rations now. Feed for the bride." His wife snorted behind the counter, covering her mouth too late to hide the grin. Nahil's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Boone slammed his coins onto the counter harder than he meant to. The jingle of metal echoed too long in the room, and for a moment the only sound was the creak of the floorboards under Nahil's weight. When they stepped back into the sunlight, a crowd had gathered. Boys pointed and laughed, one even daring to mimic her stride, his gangly legs wobbling until his friends roared. Boone's hand twitched near his belt, but Naheli put a palm against his arm, calm, steady, strong enough to anchor him. She shook her head once, and together they pushed through the gawkers. By sundown, the story had reached the saloon. Men drank on it, loud and reckless, slapping the tables as they traded cruel jokes. "Boone's ranch is broke, so he bought himself a mountain in a dress," someone shouted. A pistol fired into the ceiling, and laughter exploded like gunpowder. But not all the stares were mocking. Some were sharper, hungrier. Men who had nothing of their own looked at Nahili as though she were a prize Boone had no right to. Boone saw it in their eyes when he tied his team outside the saloon, the gleam of envy that curdles into danger. He entered with Nahil at his side, the piano music halting mid-note. Cards froze in men's hands, whiskey glasses hung suspended halfway to lips. The silence was louder than any welcome. Boone ordered one drink, the weight of every gaze pressing down on him. Nahil stood behind, tall as a sentinel, unmoved by their stares. A man in a frayed blue coat rose from his chair, weaving from drink. "Tell me, Boone," he slurred, "does she sleep indoors or do you build her a barn?" The room roared. Boone's knuckles went white around his glass. Before he could speak, Naheli stepped forward, her shadow spilling across the table. Her voice cut the air clean in two. "I sleep where I choose." The saloon hushed. The drunk blinked, mouth working for words that never came. The room had shifted mockery, turning into something heavier, more dangerous. Boone drained his glass, slammed it on the bar, and guided Nahil out before fists or bullets followed. Outside, the night was cold, the prairie wind sharp with grit. As they climbed into the wagon, Boone glanced back at the saloon windows glowing amber. Faces pressed to the glass, watching, waiting. The road home stretched black and endless. Boone's hands gripped the reins, the leather slick with sweat despite the chill. "They won't let this be," he muttered. Naheli sat straight beside him, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Let them come," she said softly. The words carried no boast, no bravado, only certainty, like the land itself had spoken through her. Boone shivered, not from the cold, but from the truth he felt in her voice. They were marked now, a spectacle to some, a target to others. The West did not forgive weakness, and it would test them both until either they broke or proved unbreakable. The days that followed settled into a rhythm as old as the land itself, work from sunup to sundown, silence broken only by the cry of hawks overhead or the groan of tired leather harnesses. Yet beneath that rhythm, something new began to take root, slow and quiet, like a seed pressing through hard earth. Nahele was no idle presence. She rose before Boone, already carrying buckets from the well by the time he pulled on his boots. Her stride never faltered under the weight of water, and she set the pails down with the ease of someone who had borne heavier burdens. Boone watched from the porch, coffee in hand, the steam curling into the chill of morning. She didn't wait for his instruction, she simply moved where the work called her, as though the land itself spoke to her in a tongue Boone couldn't hear. One afternoon, Boone wrestled with a broken fence post, sweat slicking his brow. His hands, stiff with age and labor, slipped on the wood. Before he could curse the thing, Nahil's shadow fell over him. She gripped the post, lifted it as though it were kindling, and drove it deep into the earth with a single motion. Boone stepped back, breath caught in his chest. She looked at him then, not with pride, not with mockery, but with something steadier, respect, perhaps, or simply recognition that his fight was hers now, too. The nights grew colder. The prairie wind rattled the shutters and howled through the cracks of the old house. Boone lit the fire higher, and Nahila sat across from him, silent, her hands resting like carved stone on her knees. For hours, they said nothing. But silence, Boone realized, could be a language all its own. It wasn't the emptiness he'd known before, the silence of loneliness, of wind through empty corrals. This silence had weight, presence. On the fourth night, as the fire burned low, Boone spoke. "Lost my wife 3 winters back. Fever took her quick, ain't been much left of me since." His voice cracked like dry wood, the words falling heavy. He hadn't spoken them aloud to another soul. Nahili's eyes met his, dark and steady. She didn't answer at once. Instead, she reached into the coals with the poker, stirring until sparks leapt like fireflies. Only then did she speak. "My people were taken from me, scattered, some gone to earth, some gone to chains. I walk with their voices. I do not forget." Her words hung between them, raw as the wind outside. Boone swallowed, throat tight. In her pain, he heard an echo of his own, though hers ran deeper, carved into bone by centuries. He looked at her not as the giant bride forced into his life, but as someone carrying a burden no man could measure. From that night forward, their silence changed. He began to listen for the small sounds of her presence, the scrape of her chair on the floorboards, the rhythm of her breath as she worked. She, in turn, did not push him away when their paths crossed close. Once, while leading a stubborn calf from the mud, their hands brushed on the rope. Neither pulled away. The moment was brief, but Boone carried it with him like a spark hidden deep in ash. The land tested them, as it always did. A storm swept across the plains, driving sheets of rain against the house until the roof leaked in 6 places. Boone scrambled with buckets, cursing under his breath. Nahele climbed to the roof with a hammer and shingles, her hair plastered to her face by the downpour. Boone called for her to come down before the wind took her, but she only laughed deep, rolling, and alive. A sound so rare it startled him more than thunder. He stood below, drenched and staring upward, and for the first time in years, Boone felt the weight in his chest ease. By the time the storm passed, they were both soaked through, mud to their knees. Boone offered her a blanket by the fire, his hands fumbling in their clumsy kindness. She accepted, sitting close enough that the heat of her presence warmed him more than the flames. No vows were spoken, no promises made, but in the quiet resilience of shared work, in the shadows of grief laid bare, a bond was forming, fragile yet unyielding. Boone felt it in the steadiness of her gaze, in the strength of her hands beside his, in the knowledge that whatever the town whispered, whatever dangers loomed, they were no longer two strangers tied by circumstance. They were something else now. Something the West itself might not understand, but something it could not undo. The summer of 1875 brought no mercy. The land cracked under a relentless sun, the sky a pale white sheet without a hint of rain. Boone's herd dwindled, ribs showing through their hides, and the well gave less water with each draw. The ranch creaked under the weight of survival, yet Boone and Nahil pressed on, shoulder to shoulder, bound by something deeper than necessity now. But the town had not forgotten. Whispers turned to schemes, and schemes turned to threats. Men with nothing but dust in their pockets began circling Boone's ranch like vultures. He saw them once from the ridge, 3 riders watching from the distance, their horses restless beneath them. When Boone raised his rifle, they vanished into the horizon. The message was clear. They were waiting for the right moment. That moment came on a night when the wind blew hard out of the north, carrying the smell of smoke. Boone woke first, the acrid sting burning his throat. By the time he staggered outside, flames licked the eastern fence line, spreading fast through dry grass. The herd bawled in panic, pressing against the corral rails, eyes rolling white. "Fire!" Boone shouted, rushing for the buckets, though he knew water would never hold it back. Nahile was already there, her massive frame cutting through the chaos. She threw open the corral gates, slapping the flank of a steer to drive it clear. The herd stampeded into the open prairie, hooves thundered like drums against the night. But fire was not their only enemy. Out of the smoke came figures, men on horseback, faces wrapped in bandanas, pistols glinting. The fire had been no accident. It was the cover for an attack. Boone fired first, the crack of his rifle splitting the roar of flames. A rider toppled, screaming as his horse bolted. Nahale seized a length of timber from the burning fence, swinging it like a weapon. One rider charged at her, pistol raised she struck, the fiery wood shattering his aim and sending him tumbling from the saddle. The night became a storm of heat and violence. Boone fought with the desperation of a man who had lost everything once and would not lose again. But they were outnumbered. Bullets tore into the porch posts, splinters stinging his face. His rifle jammed, he cursed, reaching for his revolver, but his hands shook from smoke and strain. Nahale roared a wordless cry, the sound carrying above the crackle of fire. She fought with fury, her strength staggering, yet even she could not hold them all. A shot rang out, and Boone saw her stumble, clutching her side. Rage surged through him, hot and blinding. He charged from cover, revolver blazing, driving the attackers back. But the fire was winning. Flames climbed the walls of the house, the roof beginning to sag. Boone stumbled toward Nahile, dragging her arm over his shoulders. "We've got to move," he shouted, voice breaking. Together they staggered into the open, the inferno devouring everything behind them, the home he had built, the memories buried in its walls, all turning to ash. The attackers, seeing the blaze consume what they'd come to take, fell back into the smoke. Their shadows melted into the night, leaving only the echo of hooves and laughter carried on the wind. Boone and Nahale collapsed in the dirt, coughing, their faces streaked with soot. The herd scattered, the ranch a ruin, the fire painting the sky blood-red above them. Boone clutched her hand so much larger than his, yet trembling now. For the first time, fear glimmered in her eyes. The land was silent again, save for the crackling ruin behind them. Boone's chest heaved as he realized the truth. Everything he had clung to, everything he had built, was gone. All that remained was the bond between them and the promise that whatever came next, they would face it together. The fire died with the dawn. Smoke hung low across the plain, curling in blue-gray ribbons over the blackened timbers that once stood as Elias Boone's home. The prairie lay silent, save for the hiss of smoldering ash and the faint call of a mourning dove in the distance. Boone knelt in the dirt, his arms wrapped around Nahil as the first light of morning spilled across them both. Her wound was shallow, the bullet grazing her side, but the blood had been enough to make Boone think he was about to lose her. They sat there until the sun cleared the horizon, two figures silhouetted against ruin. The house was gone, the herd scattered, the ranch little more than charred ground. Yet in that silence, Boone felt a strange stillness. He had lost everything before: family, fortune, even hope. But this time, he had not lost her. That truth burned brighter than the flames behind him. Weeks blurred into months. The land tested them with every step. But Boone and Nahil began again, plank by plank, furrow by furrow. They built not with haste, but with patience, every strike of the hammer echoing like a vow. Neighbors passed by on the trail, some with smirks, others with pity. Yet Boone did not bow his head, and Nahil's tall figure beside him seemed to say more than words ever could. This ranch was no place for shame, but for survival, for dignity, for the stubborn will to endure. 6 months later, the prairie bore witness to a different sight. Where black ash once lay, green shoots pushed through rows of corn and beans sprouting in the wide field, their leaves trembling in the evening breeze. The new house stood sturdier than the last, its beams thick, its roof fresh-cut cedar. Boone's hands, though rough and scarred, had carved a mark into the doorframe. E. Boone and Nahil. The letters stood deep, etched not just into wood but into the story of the land itself. Inside, the fire crackled warm against the walls. Boone sat at the table, sharpening a knife, while Naheli sewed a strip of cloth, her large hands surprisingly gentle with the needle. Around her neck hung a simple silver pendant Boone had traded for in town, a circle of metal shaped with his own clumsy engraving of a prairie star. She wore it always, not for its worth, but for the quiet truth it carried. She was no longer bound, but chosen, and she chose to remain. The town's laughter had long since turned to uneasy silence. Some men still spat when Boone passed, but others lowered their eyes in respect, for word of that night had spread. Folks said Boone and his bride stood against fire and gunfire both, and came out alive when no other could have. In the West, survival was the sharpest proof of worth, and their survival had silenced even the cruelest tongues. A year after the fire, the ranch was alive with sound again, not of flames, but of hooves, of wind through tall corn, of children's laughter drifting faint across the yard. Orphans from a nearby homestead, left adrift after sickness, now found shelter under Boone's roof. Naheli had brought them in, one by one, her towering form softening each time a small hand clutched hers. Boone watched as she guided them, steady and patient, her voice low as she taught them how to carry water, mend a fence, gather wood. Boone had never thought his land would hold life again, yet here it was, fuller than he had ever dreamed. In the evenings, he would sit on the porch, Nahele beside him, children playing in the yard. The sunset would stretch wide across the horizon, spilling gold over the fields, and Boone would think of how far they had come from the ashes. There was a night, late in autumn, when the first frost kissed the earth. Boone rose from bed, restless, and stepped outside. The stars blazed cold and countless above. He felt Nahela's hand slip into his, her grip strong, grounding him against the vast emptiness of sky. They stood in silence, the breath of their bodies mingling in the chill, and Boone knew without doubt that he had not merely bought a bride. He had found his partner, carved from fire and storm, as much a part of this land as the soil beneath their boots. The West was cruel, unforgiving, and it demanded more than most men could give. But sometimes, in its harshest corners, it granted something unexpected, a bond forged in ruin, a love that refused to bow, a future rising from ash. And so the story of Elias Boone and Nahil lingered in the winds across the prairie, carried like smoke from a dying fire into the ears of those who still wondered if hope had a place in such a land. If this story touched your heart, ride with us again across the untold trails of the Wild West. Don't forget to subscribe to keep the fire of these stories alive.